Hey folks, it's Rob Flux here with another Sunday session, and tonight is open mic night, which is your ability to ask me any question that you like on your property development journey, and I will do my best to try and steer you in the right direction. Now, in order to do so, we ask that you guys actually pre-submit your questions so that I can do whatever I need to do in order to prep for that question. So if you would like to do that for next month, you can click on the link below. So propdev.info/open-mic, and we will assess your questions, and I will do everything I can to research and give you the answers that you need on the day. So that said, we've only got a couple of questions today, so been a little bit quiet. Now, these sessions are normally the first Sunday of every month, but we did have a little bit of a delay last month with a couple of other things going on. So this week we're running 1 week late. Otherwise, it's the first Sunday of every single month. Click on the links below, and we'll do what we can to assess your questions. Now, that said, we've got a couple of questions. First one comes from Serena. So Serena, hoping that you're out there. So a fairly lengthy question, so forgive me while I read this out. Hi, Rob. I'm very new in building a building property portfolio. So I'm very confused at the moment with the best approach considering the current situation for the housing market, inflation and possible bank shortening. Definitely a lot of uncertainty ahead. I've recently bought a new property and had put my old residential home up for sale, but caught with bad timing and not attracting a buyer, and end up costing advertising fees without a return on investment. Due to limitations and restrictions of the status of the old house, subdivision is not possible. So my question is, should I hold and wait or drop my price and sell ASAP? So Serena, firstly, thank you for the question. There's actually a number of questions within this entire thing. So I will start by saying I can't tell you what to do. I don't know anything about your individual property. I don't know about the individual circumstances, the market that you're in, because there's always markets within markets. But what I can give you is some guidance on the kinds of things that you actually want to start to think about in that process. So firstly, you talked about the market. So there's how do we actually understand what the market is, where the market's going, those sorts of things. Then we want to start to understand what is your development strategy. Then after that, we want to actually look at why did you purchase the property in the first place, and is it meeting its intended purposes? So if we break it down into those 4 different elements, I think that's going to help you massively in moving forward. So firstly, let's have a look at the market. Absolutely, we have inflation at record highs at the moment and predicted to be peaking around the December timeline. The Reserve Bank of Australia has been doing, rate rises over the last several months consecutively. The last month they raised at only 0.25 basis points, which means that they're actually starting to slow down the deceleration of the market. What they're trying to do is they're trying to stop the market from overheating. Inflation causes prices to go up, okay? And by taking the heat out of the market, by making the cost to purchase actually harder, so the interest rate to pay for those loans harder, it means that people are going to be less enthusiastic in buying, which will actually then slow the market down. As a result, the market is coming off and has been slowing down in a number of areas across the country. Now, each market slows down at a different rate. So I'm going to say the ones that have been most heavily impacted have been Melbourne and Sydney, and other areas have flattened in some instances or gone backwards, but nowhere near as much. So Brisbane market, for example, has flattened, certainly slowed down, but not yet gone, I guess, in a massive backwards direction. But what we are seeing across the board is a lack of interest in buyers in the market. Now, if you go back to one of my previous Sunday sessions, it's called Over the Horizon. So with that Over the Horizon presentation, what I do is actually show you all the different ways that you can actually read the drivers that are in the market. Excuse me, frog in my throat. The drivers that are in the market and pushing the market forward, or creating what they call headwinds or tailwinds. So headwinds will be slowing us down, tailwinds will be pushing us forward. So at the moment, we've got a number of headwinds that are slowing us down, and inflation and interest rates are certainly two of those. but we've also got a whole bunch of tailwinds that are just around the corner. Okay, and so if you look at that and then try to apply that in your local geographic jurisdiction, that will tell you what is the likelihood of the market starting to turn around. Okay, now there are 16 different drivers that drive the market. So they come in the form of government incentives, they come in the form of population growth, they come in the form of supply and demand with regards to development approvals and the amount of stock that actually is coming to market. And they also come in the regards to affordability. So 16 different drivers that it's sitting across those 4 different categories. When you start to assess each one on their own merits, and you go, well, is this going to be a headwind or a tailwind, and the next one a headwind or a tailwind, and you do that over all 16, that'll give you a fair indication as to whether or not the market is going to continue to slow or if it's going to turn around and come in your direction. Now, that said, there are a number of things that are telling me that our market is being slowed down artificially at the moment because of an artificial boom. So we had an artificial boom that was created through the tail end of the COVID pandemic, with the government creating a whole bunch of government incentives that overshot the property market, plus combine that with some global challenges with regards to supply and demand and logistical challenges, etc. And what that's done is created a false boom that actually sit there, that it goes against all the fundamentals. Remember, the pandemic was something that's a one-off type situation. So what we're trying to do is RBA is trying to bring us back to having the market meet the actual true underlying market forces that are actually going to, what they call the fundamentals, that are going to be moving us forward. So keep an eye on that. I think that we're not going to be slowed down for that long. Okay. The RBA are predicting that inflation is starting to slow, and that they're predicting that it's going to, slowly slow down over all of next year and return back to within the 2 to 3%, inflation target that they're aiming for, hopefully by the end of next year. So at that point, I'm seeing that the fundamentals of the market are going to start to potentially line up. Okay. The next part, so that's where's the market going. The next part is, look, there's only 4 reasons to actually buy a property in the first place. Okay. So there is lifestyle, which is our principal place of residence. There is manufactured profit, which is what we do in the property development process. And then there's 2 investment strategies. There's capital growth, and then there's cash flow. Now, every time you buy a property, you should be making a clear determination, which one of those 4 categories have I purchased that property for? And then based on that, on a regular basis, every 3 months or every 6 months at worst, you want to go back and reassess that particular property and go, has it met its objectives as to why I bought the property in the first place? So if it's manufactured profit, then you should be executing that manufactured profit. You should be starting to execute the deal, the development opportunity. If it's capital gains, then you want to be assessing it. Am I getting the capital gains that I actually anticipate? If it's for cash flow, you want to be assessing, am I getting the cash flow that I anticipated? If the answer is, look, I bought it for one particular reason and it's not meeting its objectives, then you've got some hard decisions to make to say, well, is this an opportunity? If it's not meeting its objectives, I should say, should I sever that particular property, maybe lose a finger instead of losing an entire arm, because the reason why I bought it isn't performing? And then you want to then start to think about, well, before I actually make that decision, can I repurpose that cash in a better way based on the knowledge and skills that I've got right here, right now? So if, for example, you bought it for capital gains purposes and you're seeing that you're not getting the capital gains, you've started to learn the property development process, then you want to say, have I learned enough about that property development process to say, look, if I sell that one over, I might have some transaction costs, but can I reclaim that by the knowledge that I've gained in this new area? Or if you're not doing property development, maybe you want to stay as a property investor, then could I pick a better area where those capital gains are actually going to occur? All of those things then start to take effect. So then when you start to look at that, what's the market doing? Why did I buy the property in the first place? then you can actually start, how is it actually performing? Then you can actually start to make decisions on, is this actually a good time to be selling based on where the market is, and can I execute that? Sometimes the answer for that is yes. Hey, I want to cash in because now I want to load up in this new strategy. Sometimes the answer is no. But if you go through that framework, that's going to tell you exactly where you sit on that cycle. And I'm hoping that that points you in the direction that you want to go. Anyway, Serena, if you'd like to I guess, know a little bit more, why don't you turn up to one of your nearest meetups and come to the masterminding process. We're going to help you in those masterminding processes to try and help you on that particular journey, so you can then start to understand. But go back for homework and read my last Over the Horizon, which I did about 6 weeks ago. So it's relatively fresh, tongue-tied. My daughter had her 21st birthday last night, so I'm a little bit hoarse and raspy from helping her to celebrate that. So happy birthday, darling. Okay, next question comes from Tom. So Tom asks a question. Hey, Rob, why don't more developers hold their completed developments for 12 months to get the 50% capital gains tax benefits? Is rapid turnover worth the extra tax that you would have to pay? Thanks, and keep up the great work. So Tom, mate, I really, really appreciate the question, but what I'd like to do is try to just correct you on the question itself, because I think you've got confusion between investment and development. Okay, so if you are investing, that is, you have a long-term hold for the property for a long period of time, that is where capital gains tax then starts to apply. If you are developing, i.e. you're turning over projects very, very fast, capital gains tax doesn't apply, and instead GST applies, so goods and services tax. And so it's not a matter of, hey, holding the property in the hope that capital gains tax discount would apply, because it just doesn't. So the ATO has a look at your intention, and based on your intention, they say, are you running what they deem to be an enterprise? That's the word that the ATO uses. The enterprise meaning you're running a business. So property development is a business. We go in with the express purpose of knocking down one thing and turning that into many other things. And so they see that as, I guess, being in a business. And because of that, they're going to say GST will apply. And so from a property developer's perspective, that GST is going to apply irrespective. And so what they're looking at is how quickly they can turn their projects over in order to get their cash back to reload and go into the next project. So that's the first part of your question. The second part of your question, which is actually a really good question, is why don't more developers actually hold their stock? Now, that is I guess, one that I have been preaching for quite some time into my communities, to say, look, I actually had 20 years of buy and hold before going into the property development space. So I recognize the benefits of investing versus developing. And so for me personally, what I try to do is I try to blend those two worlds together. And so I do try to keep my stock as a long-term investment. So firstly, if you do keep your stock, what it means is that because you don't actually turn the property over at that point in time, the taxes that you rightfully touched on don't become due unless and until you actually sell. So if you hold it for a long period of time, you've effectively got yourself into a tax deferral process, which means that your profits are trapped in the property, but it's 100% of your profits trapped in there. And so that is 100% of the property will actually grow with the market as capital growth actually then starts to occur. Okay, so when that starts to happen, if you have kept enough equity in the deal with the profit that you've actually generated, it should actually be positively geared. And so it should be able to fund its way and you not have to tip in. Okay, so what we're trying to do is generate enough cash flow to actually get it to actually stand on its own 2 feet. Now, that said, a lot of people are tempted to do that very, very early in the process. The first project, I want to keep the asset and hold that onto it. Now, the problem is that the profit that we generated was only very, very small compared to the debt that's in the property. And so what we do is we hang on to this debt, and that becomes an anchor around our neck. So we want to be very careful, because that's going to impact our serviceability, our borrowing capacity, and a whole bunch of things like that. But if, however, the profit on the deal is much, much bigger and the debt is much, much smaller, then this is no longer a burden for us. And so there is a time where it's a good idea to keep and a time where it's a bad idea to keep. And one of the things that help to influence this, and again, I've got a previous Sunday session where I've actually gone into should I buy or should I sell, and go back and actually have a look at that. And what we're looking at is say, how do we actually minimize the debt, the debt of the residual property in the at the end of the project, and have enough passive cash flow that it can actually wash its own face and keep itself self-contained. Now, if you've been watching me for long enough, you'll know that there's a magic formula where that becomes a no-brainer, okay? And so most of us know that we are aiming as property developers to get ourselves a 20% profit on cost. That's 20%. Now, if we do that, the magic formula is 6. If we can create 6 of something, it could be 6 townhouses, 6 apartments, 6 house and land packages. If we can create 6 of those with a 20% profit on cost, then if we sell 5, then that will actually pay down the cost, and the 6th one will be owned free and clear. Now, when we do that and we start to own it free and clear, we have the ability to hold that asset, and it will grow with the market over time. It is 100% positive cash flow, which means that that is going to help us towards our financial freedom goal. Now, in this particular instance, our intention to run a development has actually happened. So GST would apply for the 5 that actually were kept. But our intention was to keep the profit on the last one. And so capital gains tax has the potential to apply. Now, I want to be very clear here, the potential to apply. The ATO want to make sure that we haven't just done this to game the system, okay? So they have a timeline that they measure it against and say, well, if you hold that property, and I believe it's either 5 or 6 years, but I think it's 5. If you hold that for 5 years, then GST no longer applies, and then instead it reverts to capital gains tax. And so there's a period of time, if you sell it at the 4-year mark, GST would still apply. If you sell it at the 5+ year mark, then it transitions across, GST no longer applies, and capital gains tax applies. Now, when you do so, it's capital gains tax against what? Remembering you manufactured this out of thin air because you've actually done the property development process, and it's a profit. Well, what the ATO are going to do is they're going to ask you to actually go back and look at what they call the cost base. So they're going to say, what was the percentage of the land of the original property that would be applied? So 1/6 of the land cost, 1/6 of the development cost, 1/6 of all the contribution fees, 1/6 of all the interest rates, 1/6 of all of those things would then go to become the base for, I guess, that particular property, and the capital gain tax would be based on what that base was, because that's the cost it actually cost you to actually manufacture that in the first place. And so I guess in summary, capital gains tax would not apply if you were selling in 12 months. Instead, that would be GST. It has the potential to apply if your intention is to hold the property for more than 5 years, in which case you would get that 50% capital gains tax discount. If, and a very big if here, you held it in an entity that qualified for that 50% capital gains tax discount. So be very, very careful that you've got the right entities in place. Otherwise, you should be trying to, in the early days, turn your projects over as quick as humanly possible, get the cash in, reload, and get out. So with our debt, we want to inflate the debt for the project and shrink it at the end of the project, and then inflate it and then shrink it. And just like a balloon, when you inflate it the first time and you shrink it, it never goes back to the original shape. And so what is left over is the profit. And then you inflate it again for the next project and you shrink it, and hopefully the profit is bigger. And then you keep doing that several times until what you've left over is the property that you get to keep outright. In which case there is no debt associated with it. So you don't care about interest rates going up. You don't care about inflation. All you care about is that you've actually got no vacancies and that what the rental returns are on the property. Anyway, Tom, was a really great question, mate. Thank you very much for that. Take a very quick sip. Next one is from Daniel. So Daniel says, I have a duplex project. The building contract has been signed, and now I'm just waiting for the formal approval for the construction loan. One thing to mention is that the building contract requests a deposit and milestone or stage payments, whereas the quantity surveyor only recommends progress payments on cost to complete basis. Obviously, cost to complete payments affect builders' cash flow, and no deposit is paid by the lender. If there is a gap between the builder's invoice and the quantity assessment, I will need to pay the gap to the builder out of my own pocket. What's the best way to negotiate with the lender to get them to agree with the milestone payment schedule in the building contract? So, Daniel, that's a fantastic question, mate. And fundamentally, you're actually saying the same thing, but in different ways. Okay. So I guess the building and construction industry has been running for a very, very long time with this exact dilemma that you're actually raising. And so what you'll typically find is that the builder's in payment schedule is actually reflective of exactly the cost to complete. So what they're actually saying is, look, this is how much we've actually done so far. The quantity surveyor would actually go out on site and say, yes, you have met the framing stage and you've installed the amount of timber that you proposed that you're going to in your original build. And so the two will actually line up. Now, that said, what you want to make sure is you want to get your quantity surveyor to give an assessment as to what they believe the quantities or the bill of quantities would be at each of those stage payment timelines. So now most building contracts that are, I guess, the smaller ones in nature, so the HIA and the master builders and those sorts of things, they have very particular stage payments that are the exact same every single time. So your quantity surveyor would be very familiar with those, so you're going to have the foundations being laid, you're going to have the framing being done, you're going to have lockup, or practical completion, all those sorts of things. So you want to make sure that your quantity surveyor gives you a report that says, this is what we predict will be the cost at that particular point in time, based on looking at your plans, looking at your bill of schedules with regards to the bill of quantities as to what is actually in there, the amount of labor we anticipate, etc. And they should actually marry up. Now, if they don't marry up, that's a conversation between you and the builder right at the start, okay? And say, look, the QS has said that this is where they're expecting those costs to be. You've said this is where you're expecting them to be. What's the gap? And now you can have a more qualified and open conversation with the builder at that point in time. Say, well, why are these actually not marrying up? It would be fantastic if you could actually point that out. Equally, you want to have the quantity surveyor actually reporting on where they think they're meant to be and why they think there's a gap sitting there. Now, in most instances, those two will marry up quite comfortably, so it shouldn't actually be anything other than a process to follow in order to do that. Your question then was, well, what's the best way to negotiate with the lender to get them to agree the milestone payments? Mate, they actually are already doing that, so that shouldn't actually be a problem. The question is whether or not there's a difference between the QS and the build. And if the difference is, why is there a difference? And now it might be a three-way conversation between the QS, the builder, and the financier to actually recognize what's actually happening in that particular instance. So for example, the builder might have overestimated the amount of materials needed for one particular stage, or they might have accounted for the fact that the materials are likely to go up in cost between now and then, and so they're trying to account for that. The QS may have made different assumptions, and so what you're going to do is you're going to marry those two lots of assumptions together, and you're going to come to a negotiated decision together with regards to what is fair and reasonable given the project and the complexity of the project. Anyway, hope that helps, Daniel, and mate, always interesting going through those particular scenarios. So not many questions this week, folks. This is the last question, which I'm actually quite surprised at. I'll see if there is a sneaky one that has come through at the last minute, but I don't think there has. I have one more that's sitting here, I think. So here we go. What do we got? Okay, so two more. So Paul says, hey Rob, can you please run me through your method for understanding market research to confirm GRV, so that's gross realized value, for a development site you are looking at? I understand that you need to become an area expert and build rapport with local agents, but what specific software do you use and recommend to do the research on historical sales for an area? So, Paul, that is a fantastic question. So there is multiple stages to here. So firstly, I'm going to say there's two lots of software that you are going to need. You're going to need a sales research tool, and you're going to need a development research tool. Now, with those two, they do slightly different things, but there are some small crossover elements that actually sit there. So from a sales research tool, there are the traditional ones, which would be Pricefinder or RP Data. Then there's also the one that I guess we are working on called National Property Data, which is currently alive in New South Wales, Victoria, and Queensland, and soon to be Northern Territory and Western Australia. And I'm going to say in the not too distant future, that's going to be all the way around the country. So now that is the tool that I am a director of, so a little bit biased in that, but it's basically trying to do everything that RP Data and Pricefinder are doing, plus a whole bunch more, by taking that development focus to it. And saying, hey, we need to actually understand a few more things. We need to be able to search on zoning. We need to be able to search on frontage. We need to be able to search on, is it a multiple lot or split a lot type property? Those sorts of things that go, how do we actually work out what is actually there? So that's the sales research tool. Then you've got the development research tool. So the development research tool is looking at your zonings and your overlays and your constraints that actually determine whether or not the property is actually applicable. So you need to actually have both tools when you actually start to do your research. So the first thing you want to do, understand your development strategy, understand the, I guess, the development size that you're actually looking for. And then you want to start to do two lots of research. So one, what does the raw site actually sell for? So that is the zoning and the land size that you are looking for. What has that been selling for in your particular area? So that is going to tell you whether or not it's a developer that purchased it or an emotional purchaser that purchased it. It's telling you what a raw site will actually sell for. Now, when you start to do that, you're going to start to assess the property in such a way that you're going to take the same view that a valuer does, because sometimes a sale is not representative of market value. Okay, so a valuer has a legal definition that they actually have to work to, and don't ask me to quote this exactly, but it has to be a well-informed purchaser purchasing off a person who is not in distress in selling it. Okay, so for example, if somebody is under the threat of, I guess, a mortgagee taking over the property, and somebody's taking advantage of that, that does not represent a fair market value. Okay. Equally, a deceased estate is not a informed purchaser buying it off somebody trying to sell it at market price. So there's a number of things that you need to start to look at. You go, well, I'm going to do all of my sales research using National Property Data, which is my tool of choice. We're going to use that tool to say, what would a typical raw site sell for? Okay, and sometimes you'll find that an emotional purchaser will pay more for a development site, and sometimes you'll find that a developer will pay more. The next thing we want to do is we want to do their research on what does the finished product sell for. So we're looking for the exact product that you intend to create. So if you're intending to create land, you're going to search for land. If you intend to create brand spanking new homes, you want to search for new homes. If you intend to build duplexes, you're going to search for all the duplexes. If you're going to do townhouses, you're going to search for townhouses. So what you're trying to work out is, what does the raw one sell for, and what does the finished product sell for? And remember, you're selling multiple. So if you're doing 6-pack townhouses, you know what the typical townhouse will sell for. What does 6 of them sell for? So that's going to give you your GRV. And then what you're then going to do is, what's the arbitrage between the two? So if I buy one thing and sell 6 things, what is the difference? And the difference you're hoping will actually cover the cost of the development approval, will cover the cost of construction, and leave enough headroom on the table for your profits. Now, there is some challenges with that approach, okay? So the challenges are that any sales research tool can only be reflective of a transaction that has absolutely categorically gone through to completion. So, for example, if the townhouse was sold off the plan, then the contract may have been written and signed, but the townhouse is still being constructed. You can't settle on that because the title doesn't exist, and it can't exist unless and until the property exists. And so you may have a contract signed that may not necessarily hit the sales research tool for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, maybe even 2 years sometimes after the sale has actually occurred. And so that's where building the relationships with your agents then starts to become super, super important. You're going to understand which agents in the area are the ones who specialize in selling off the plan, and you're going to know what developments are actually happening in the area. Speak to every single one of those agents and say, hey, I'm about to build the same thing in this area. I would love to know what you've sold off the plan, which hasn't necessarily hit the portals yet. And so you're going to account for those as well in your assessments. And in many instances, you're going to see sale prices that are much, much higher than what have actually transacted already, because the ones that transacted may have been a reflection of where the market was 2 years ago when they sold off the plan. Okay. So there's quite often a little bit of lag in that stuff. So it's a combination of using the sales research tool, National Property Data, using a development research tool and seeing what development applications are actually happening in the area, then going and building relationships with the agents because you're an expert, and then marrying all of that up together. So it is quite a bit of work in order to do that, Paul, but if you are narrowing it down with my suggestions, which is one strategy, one council, 3 suburbs, if you do that, then becoming an area expert in just those 3 suburbs becomes really, really easy for you to know that level, do that level of work, and know that level of knowledge that you need to get to. So hoping that gets you to where you want to go, mate. And then this looks like it's the last question from Tony. So Tony says, what is the quickest way to find the next council to get a green light with rough cut FISO after you've selected and found red in your current council? So Tony is actually referring to a process that I teach our students in our property development formula program. So Tony is one of my students. And so that's probably a question, Tony, that is a little bit better for our Monday night mentoring sessions, my friend. So I'm more than happy to answer that in there. But I'll answer in a very, I guess, much broader concept so that everyone can actually understand what we're talking about. The rough cut FISO that Tony is referring to there is actually building on what I just touched on with Paul. So what we do there, Paul, is we take the typical sale price of the raw product, and we take the typical sale price of the finished product, and we do a rough cut FISO, which is a suburb-wide level of assessment. So the concept being, if I can buy on average, run an average project, and sell on average, would on average I actually make money, and that gives us a red light or a green light for the suburb. That's what rough cut actually does. So what it does is it means that we're going to be in areas that have a high probability of success if we can buy at market rate. Now, that's a fantastic concept in order to do that, but not every suburb will actually work. And what Tony's referring to there is, hey, he's gone and assessed that this particular council is giving him nothing but red lights all the way across the board, which means not that there is no deals in the area. It just means that he has to buy under market value or have an absolute cracking deal in order for that to actually make sense. And so in many instances, it just doesn't. So my suggestion, mate, is go back to, I guess, the earlier steps in the process. Go back and check your checklist and go back to say, well, I'm going to look at where is the next most geographically convenient council for you that fit all of the criteria as to where your state government is pushing population to actually go. So now for anyone else who is interested in the teachings that we actually do there, that is from our property development formula program, as I touched on. So you can go and read all about that at the link below. And it's an application-only process, folks. We don't let everybody in, and the reason is it's not a good fit for everyone. Not everyone is willing to do the work that it actually takes to become a property developer, you're effectively taking on a new career. So we want to make sure that it's a good fit for you, and it's a good fit for us to actually make sure that you actually get the outcomes that you're actually looking for. Now, that said, that was our last question for the night. And so if you would like to participate in an open mic night, we run these on the first Monday of every month. Sorry, first Sunday. Sorry, getting my tongue tied. This week was an exception. If you would like to pre-lodge a question for me to lodge, click on the links below. And what you can then do, submit your questions. I'll do whatever research that I need to do to make that happen. And then based on that, I'll answer you on our next open mic night. So that said, I'm just going to see if I can go and grab some questions from our community. And so let me just grab 2 seconds and see if there's, given that I've got plenty of time, see if we can actually find some questions from you guys. Now, it's going to take me a second or two to actually navigate there. Hang on while I do that. It's been a big weekend, folks. And for some reason, this live is, here we go, 2 secs. Okay, what do we got here? Okay, we got a whole bunch of questions. So Hasriman says, hi Rob, I follow you and also PDN member for the last few months. Got a lot of knowledge, but I've realized that I need to outsource the project management to another company as I'm time poor and also afraid of putting out a wrong foot. They will secure the site, do all the due diligence, which I will oversee, of course, and also manage the project from start to finish. The project management cost is 8% of the construction value. I want to move into one of the townhouses. I want this done earlier rather than later. They are a reputable company and have a good track record. What are your thoughts on my approach? Any words of wisdom? So, mate, there's a couple of comments there that I'm going to touch on. So, firstly, many of us have the challenge with regards to time commitments. And so I understand that. And the idea of outsourcing the work is a fantastic idea on one and one condition only, okay? That is that you are delegating the tasks and not abdicating the tasks. So by delegation, it means that you know exactly whether or not what they are doing is a good job. You can assess their capabilities, their strengths, their weaknesses. You can assess, is it a really good deal? You can assess whether or not it is I guess, a perfect deal in the first place. If, on the other hand, you are just asking them to go find a site and trusting them, and you have no ability to actually check and measure that capability, you're abdicating the decision, which means that you have no ability to determine whether or not they are telling you the truth, whether or not they have well intentions, and whether they make a mistake, all those sorts of things. So you want to be super, super careful in actually doing that. My guidance would be go and actually learn the process. Now, you don't have to do the work, but you do need to learn the process. And if you learn the process, then when you delegate, now you can actually be able to successfully assess whether or not what they're bringing you is actually a good deal, etc. So that's part one. Part two is, well, their costs and the way they're actually doing their cost is actually very counterintuitive. So 8% of construction value. Well, let's think about their motives here. So 8% of construction value. Well, they have no incentive at all to reduce the cost of the construction, because that also reduces their payment for the project management. So they're instead better off to actually go for the more expensive builder and tell you that they're actually a better outcome, because then they get a 8% of a higher price point. So be super, super careful with that billing method, because it's just plain crazy. You know, anyone who's charging on a percentage of construction value does not have the correct motives to drive the right behavior in their business. Now, they might have the right intentions and they might be a respectable company. So I'm not challenging that. What I'm saying is, look, if they've got an underlying incentive to actually not go saving you money, why would they? You know, why would they go to the extra effort to save you money if it means it actually reduces money in their pocket? Similarly, if they are charging on a dollar an hour's work for an hour's pay, then again, they have no incentive in being efficient in the project. Okay, so if they're efficient in the project, then you want them to do the least amount of work humanly possible to get the deal actually done. But you want them to use systems and processes that they've done many, many times before. If you're paying on an hourly rate basis, you're actually rewarding them for their inefficiency. The more inefficient they are, the more hours that they generate, the more paid that they actually get. So there's only really two methods that are, I think, fair and reasonable in this approach. So method number one would be milestone payments. So if they meet very specific milestones, they are going to give you a fixed price on what that actually looks like. So you know exactly what you're signing up to. Whether the deal is profitable or not is irrespective. But instead, you want to know what you're actually signing into. Now, that said, again, there's not a huge amount of incentive for them to do a really good job. But what you do know is that they're not incentivized to spend more hours, and they're not incentivized to spend more money. Instead, you can actually manage them correctly and say, well, I want to make sure, I want to sanity check that you've got 3 quotes, and I want to see that you've actually done that. If they're inefficient in their construction, you're not impacted by that. If they're ineffective in their project management, you're not affected by that because it's given you a fixed price. Okay. So the other method would be a profit split arrangement. And that is, you find an appropriate amount of profit that you think is fair and reasonable based on the complexity of the deal and the amount of effort that they've actually got to go to. Now they're incentivized on coming on time, on budget, and they're incentivized to actually reduce the cost and become more profitable. They're going to help you to actually get the highest sale price for the property and become more profitable, because the more profitable that the project is, the more money that they actually get. So you're actually driving the right behavior in actually do that. Anyway, hoping that's some words of wisdom there. So Karen says, hi, Rob, how are you? And Dan has given a link to the ATO with regards to property development. So thank you, and the taxes that actually apply. So thank you, mate. That's great. Karen has said 5 years for the GST to capital gains tax transition. So thank you very much for that, Karen. That's greatly appreciated. That was the number I thought it was, but I didn't want to say something I wasn't actually 100% sure of. And Ben says, well done, legend. Hats off. Thank you, mate. Really appreciate that. And lucky last question that's coming in through YouTube is from, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, Ko. Hi, Rob. Thanks for the information sessions. Why, when, and how do developers usually sell off the plan after development approval? Advantages and disadvantages, and when borrowing capacity does not suffice. So typically, there's 2 reasons to be selling off the plan, Kyo. Firstly, you may have gone to a financier that mandates that you must sell off the plan in order to cover your debt coverage that they are going to lend to you. Now, typically, the big banks will want you to sell off the plan. And so if you're selling off the plan, that has some negative implications, but it also has some positive implications. So firstly, what it does is it reduces the risk of the project. So that is super, super important. So by reducing the risk of the project, you have absolute certainty that the sale has actually occurred, that you know exactly what the price point is going to be, and that by the time you actually pull the trigger for construction, you can measure what the anticipated profit is going to be, and you're going to be able to just follow the bouncy ball to get that through to completion. So that's the risk management perspective. And so if you're looking at a big 4 bank, they will almost certainly want you to have 100% debt coverage. That is, if you've got $3 million worth of construction loan that you're borrowing, they will want to see $3 million worth of pre-sales to make sure that is covered. Now, sometimes they'll actually ask for more than that just to make sure that they're covered. Now, if you go for a 2nd tier or a 3rd tier lender, they might want much less pre-sales and sometimes even no pre-sales. And instead, they allow you to just start construction straight away, which means that you get momentum and activity on the property in the first instance. Now, let's have a look at the implications of a pre-sale. Now, in a booming market, when the market is taking off, pre-selling off the plan means that you're going to cap the amount of profit that you could have got at the tail end because the market kept on going. If you had sold it as a finished product, you may have left money on the table. In the reverse situation where the market is dropping, what you're doing is you're putting a floor and you're basically locking in your profits. And as the property market actually goes down, you've actually locked it in at a fairly high rate as much as humanly possible. So where you are in the market is going to have a huge implication on that. And also, I guess, which finance you're going to have is going to have a big implication as well. Now, that said, if you sell off the plan, there's a couple of things to be very mindful of. Firstly, selling off the plan typically means that you're going to have a valuer go and value the property in a as if complete state. So they're going to have a look and say, look, based on your fixtures and fittings that you're trying to put into this property and the quality of the build, looking at the market, this is what we can actually see that would actually sell for. Now, the valuer is typically going to be quite conservative in that instance because he's assuming that what you've put on paper is actually what you've built. So they have to be very, very careful because they have very high insurance premiums if they get the valuation wrong. So quite often they'll be a little bit more conservative in that price point. You then sell based on that price point, and then the incoming purchaser comes in and says, well, I'm not 100% sure if what you've shown me on that mood board is actually what you're going to build, because I don't know, I can't touch it, feel it, smell it, taste it, I can't walk through the property, I don't know what the quality of the build is going to be, I'm taking a risk here. So quite often they'll ask for a discount. And then also on top of that, you're typically selling through a project marketer rather than a real estate agent, and they tend to ask for higher commissions. And so if you're selling off the plan, quite often you don't get the benefit of receiving the higher price point that you actually would achieve if you sold as a finished product. The converse of that is, well, let's run the gauntlet, take the risk, actually sell as a finished product. The problem here now is you're going to hope like heck that the market is exactly where you need it to be at the time that you get there. Because if the market is slow and you don't sell, you're at peak debt. You've constructed everything and you're holding maximum capacity of a debt perspective. And so you need to turn these things over fast. Yes, you might potentially get a higher price point, but if there's nobody in the market buying right now because you've either A, picked the market poorly, the timing of the market, or B, maybe you didn't give them a product that was actually appropriate, that can actually be quite challenging. So why do you sell off the plan? Risk mitigation. That's basically it. So you're looking at whether it's the bank's risk mitigation or your risk mitigation. You're trying to make sure that you are not exposed to that market cycle and the market risk. Instead, you're going to lock in your profits. But in locking it in, you're putting a glass ceiling on what those profits are actually going to be. And that in itself can be a little bit challenging, mate. So, okay, that appears to be the last question. Let me just go back to Facebook, see if there's anything else there. No, there's not. So I'm going to say, folks, we're going to leave it at that. Thank you very much for, I guess, all of your questions. And I look forward to seeing you on the next Open Mic Night. On the first Sunday of every month. Click on the link below and send your questions early. That said, that's all, folks.